here. We are going to debate the motion from round 4 yesterday, the one about glorification of professional esports players. We have the magnificent teams here of on team government, the ESL speakers, Juanita and Illija, and on team opposition, we have Brent and Abhinav. Reminder to everyone that after this, we will also be practicing judging. So Julio Meyer and myself will be doing a deliberation that you can watch our comments during the deliberation. Afterwards, I will give a quick OA and Julio will give quick remarks on tracking engagement. Note, today's focus will be heavily on engagement because we wanted to do different skills every day. So we highly encourage judges who want to use it to practice to also take special attention to engagement, what they think was sufficient and insufficient rebuttal, so they can compare it later on with our notes. Great. Without further ado, I am very happy to call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Okay, I'll just quickly want to check that I'm audible.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll be starting my speech.
Sorry, how do you want people? How do you want to take it? In the chat or verbally?
Yeah, POIs in the chat. If I have not taken one at 5:30, do it by voice. If you also want to raise your hand with the Zoom thingy, that would be great. Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to be very clear on how does glorification look like and what does it entail. Glorifying professional esport players looks like firstly, marketing the career path these people take as 1, attractive, 2, accessible, and 3, enjoyable. This looks like making targeted ads for people to see that this is fun, this is something that most of the people can do, and this is something that is enjoyable for most of them. 2, it's framing esports players as role models, showing their progress, their effort, and their sacrifices, ultimately portraying their lifestyles as something desirable. 3, showing them as national icons or representation of desired social values, such as Faker in South Korea, and how is it that he is portrayed as someone who entails social desirable values within the South Korean society. And crucially, in cases where esports are more relevant and in places or countries where esports take a huge part of culture, it even means creating government associations of esports. It means having big TV broadcasts of these kind of tournaments. And 3, it even means creating schools and other places in terms of training for esports and preparing yourself to be professional in esports, such as the schools that are currently existing in South Korea. Any clarification points on how does glorification look like?
Yeah, can you clarify who you think the glorification is applying to? So are they glorified in everyone's eyes or just gamers?
I think they're largely glorified not only in gamers' eyes, 1, because of the idea of ads, 2, because of the idea of TV broadcasts being crucially widespread in reality. But yeah, I would be willing to concede that this is going to harm gamers disproportionately. I'm still going to win by explaining to you, A, why is it that it is going to trap people in a toxic environment, and B, why is it that the broader possibilities of regulation are harder in side government. So let's start with why people are trapped in a toxic environment. Look, I want to be very clear with this. Esports have an entrenched toxic environments. People insult heavily themselves within the games, are heavily sexist, and this is a place currently having people who have heavily immature behavior, socially awkward individuals that do not know how to react when they are in pressured situations. This likely looks like people engaging in fights that become and snowball into things that are deemed worse in their scenario, having social situations in which they do not understand what are the harms they are facing or what are the harms they are inflicting on other people. But secondly, I want to be very clear in why regulation of this behavior is currently difficult in a stance of glorification. One, because socialization processes within the esports have risen the threshold of what is deemed offensive and not tolerable in reality, especially because this socialization happens in a niche scenario where they think that they need to behave as other to fit in. This especially happens because of people who are gamers, are teenagers, or mostly people in their youth, which likely makes them feel pressured to uphold social standards within the socialization that is in a closed environment. It is unlikely then that we're able to trash the loop of bad behavior here. Second, because of the creation of role models that it's exclusive to glorification. And I want to be very clear with this. When you're glorifying professional esports players who are the best and who are the most accessible to people to watch and to admire within the game, it is likely that these people are going to be over the institutions that regulate within the esport. Why is this likely? One, because they are heavily justified by their fans. Two, because they can assume sanctions imposed to them either by their clubs or by the game, by the esport itself, because they have enough money to make the trade-off. Three, because they gain big enough fan base to be independent from their clubs and teams. They're able to have massive viewership in Twitch, 50,000 people watching them. It is unclear then how is it that these clubs are able to sway their behavior. The problem here is as they are glorified and shown to have good values in reality, it is likely that this is going to askew the way people see what is deemed adequate in esports in reality. Why is this particularly bad within glorification? Look, when you glorify being professional in esports, it is likely that you get less resistance from your parents and other people around to dedicating yourself to esports. It is second, more likely that you're going to be incentivized to make trade-offs with important parts of your life to try and pursue a career in esports. This is leaving school. This is focusing on esports rather than school. This is investing your money in esports training, appliances, and servers instead of investing them in other scenarios in your life. This likely means that then it is particularly creating a sunken cost for you to leave the toxic environment. It is unclear then how is it that when you think you have the ability to have a career path here, how is it that you leave when toxic environment is harming you heavily in the comparative? Why is toxic environment bad? Look, people are in their teenage years, early 20s, and they're emotionally unstable. They suffer significant changes in their life. They're unaware of the harms they might cause, and they're unaware of how this is going to affect them in the future. It is likely then that they have small opportunities of emotional support because the competitive area or the competitive scenario that they're living within sports, and because people outside from the esport does not understand the situation, and therefore people are likely feeling alienated by people who try to emotionally support them but do not understand the esports. It is likely then that these people are not only heavily alienated, feeling a toxic environment, but there are no incentives to get out of the toxic environment we're really proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for an excellent speech.
One. I think it's worth noting from the top here that in my entire life, never once while I was playing a sport like rugby or basketball growing up, Was there ever a question as to how it was that I was using my time or where the trade-offs might apply? Society treats sports where you dribble a ball or you carry a ball into an end zone as if there's something kind of unique and valuable about them. And the shame and stigma that is often associated with things like playing video games never comes into play. The reality that Gov is going to need to deal with in this debate is that glorification gives us a great degree of removal of stigma for a hobby that literally hundreds of millions of people engage in the status quo. And there are massive benefits to that glorification, particularly given some of the framing that Gov employs in this round. Two arguments that we're going to advance here on side opposition, some extraneous rebuttal before that, but our two arguments are going to be on why it is that we get more validation of people who engage in video games as a hobby on our side, as well as how some of the power dynamics change and why we're happy to have more power in the hands of esports athletes rather than in some of the other places where they currently reside. Okay. Couple of pieces of extraneous rebuttal. I think it's really worth noting that one of the first things that Gov notes correctly is likely to change as a result of glorification is a massive increase in the amount of marketing and the degree to which there's going to be things like government associations, schools, and investment into esports. This is really, really important. And the reason that it's important is because a lot of the harms that they discuss and a lot of the problems that they discuss about toxicity and the nature of the way that some of these activities can currently look and have looked in the past is likely to change in an environment where there is a certain degree of sponsorship and there is a certain degree of money. Why is that the case? Well, if you are someone like, I don't know, say Gatorade trying to sponsor an esports athlete, you are going to care more about what that person says and more about how that person interacts with their community than you would otherwise. And similarly, the esports athlete is going to have to place a check on those kinds of things as well. This is really important to the round because it suggests that glorification is going to be a check against some of the worst toxicity and potentially going to even increase the decrease the toxicity that exists within these communities. A couple of other extraneous responses. First of all, when they say that role models necessarily end up having power dynamics that exceed regulation. For a couple of reasons, I think this ends up being good, especially when you understand that these companies often own the games and in a way that isn't true of other sports. And it's probably better that we have people who play the games and people who have a different kind of relationship with them exercising some kind of power. So I'm not convinced that that's bad, but I'll also note that it isn't entirely clear from this argument why it is that what regulations were being referred to begin with. I'm also not convinced when side government says that there's going to be a huge harm of people trying to pursue esports and not listening to parents and making other kinds of trade-offs that would be negative, how unique this is particular to this kind of glorification. This could be said about any type of sport, but just as importantly, I think it's worth noting that it's probably good for some people that do want to exercise this as their hobby. And, you know, not everyone is going to try to pursue this as a career. Some of this is just about the social acceptance of what it is that you do, what it is that you watch, that we get a certain degree of buy-in and social acceptance of these types of activities. Moving on to constructive. Let's first talk about validation. I want to note right off of the top here that video games, as I mentioned in the introduction, are incredibly popular. And as people, we often want to see ourselves reflected in society in some way. And this does really matter, right? Because in a world where the types of people that get glorified all tend to come from the same kinds of activities, whether it's, you know, Hollywood media or whether it's like sports that really, really emphasize physical traits and an ability to succeed in those ways. Esports have a younger audience, as government concedes, and also target a different group of people, and a group of people that in many ways can actually be vulnerable and that we think can be benefited on our side of the house. Couple of reasons why I think that that ends up being the case. First, stigma and alienation. Again, note here the degree to which this is an activity that is massively stigmatized and massively alienated. People are very, very wary of talking about the degree to which they play video games, and society has, as I think was somewhat clear from some of the government argumentation, a negative perception about what it means to be spending your time on playing a game. And that probably ends up impacting people who are perceived as nerds or people who are perceived as, you know, like less valuable just because of what it is that they choose to do with their free time. But I'll note that even if we're talking about the people that Gov seems most concerned with in this debate, which are the people who are going to be unduly influenced and the people who are going to potentially make bad choices by virtue of this toxic environment, those who are incredibly lonely, the young men who are now shutting themselves into their rooms and like literally not leaving and playing video games. This is a phenomenon that is increasing more and more. I would suggest to you that we live in a better world where people can see themselves reflected in a role model and glorified and are encouraged to do things like participate in more social versions of this activity, right? Because note that there are many different kinds of video games, but engaging in esports or engaging in the kinds of video games that are likely to lead to interactions with other are potentially a good immunization against some of the loneliness and depression that people feel. And I also just think that it's a shame that an activity that does give us an escape from reality, that does provide a lot of these kinds of benefits, is seen with such stigma, and people end up having to feel bad just because it is that they want to pursue some type of good for themselves. Second, let's talk about power dynamics. First, about how this impacts companies and the way that this changes streaming. But first, as a frame here, I think it's important to note that glorification means greater autonomy and power to individual esports. Gov actually concedes this. But the thing that I think needs to be noted here, we can make a bunch of assertions about whether or not esports are likely to be toxic and terrible in comparison to the way that other role models would be, or whether or not they would act in good ways. That's just going to end up being incredibly assertive. But what I think we can say about esports athletes is that they're likely to be incredibly passionate about and skilled at the games that they play. So why does that matter? In terms of the interactions with companies, they just have different incentives. They're likely to be able to criticize companies when they make decisions about these games that can end up being harmful both to competitive balance, or just tell kids, for instance, look, you don't need to buy skins and you don't need to spend tons and tons of money on loot boxes. It also changes the nature of who gets benefits in terms of streaming. No longer do we get the kinds of people who are only loud and brash, but now some emphasis on skill and talent. At the end of the day, we get some validation for people who wouldn't be validated on their side, proud to oppose.
Of esport players doesn't provide this much higher validation than what that would exist without that glorification. Secondly, how this is actually worse for players and actually removes their autonomy. Thirdly, how this glorification specifically provides distorted information to the potential new professional players, and why it is much worse. Now, all of the responses are going to be integrated. Now, firstly, about the validation. Opening opposition says, look, there are some kids, they are playing video games. It is seen as not really cool in society. Some of them are bullied. The parents think it's very stupid. They frown upon about this, etc. And because of this glorification of esport players, we don't have, they have some sort of feeling that they are validated, that they can be cool as well, or that they do matter. Now, we concede that this exists. However, we say that this exists even without the glorification of professional esports player. Why? Because even in the absence of these huge leagues of national TV broadcasting huge, Dota games and things like that, there are still kids who go and like play video games, like in together in groups. There are smaller competitions where like tournaments when they compete with each other, etc. There is validation among peers, among those peers that are playing those games. Newsflash, I went to a mathematical high school, which you might notice has a lot of people who are actually gamers and playing video games. Not all of them are very good in sports. Like we all fail at football and usually popular stuff. However, and there were no streaming was not a thing when I went to school. Now, what is still many of these people were still validated. Why? Because they could play among their peers, they can compete among them and actually be cool in these local circuits. So it is not removed. You don't need to have someone who is popular by so many people, maybe later if you like, then in order to be validated and to have validation. Now, the logic might go that, yeah, but now also some other members of society are going to validate you and accept you, etc. No, just because there is a glorification of some phenomenon in society doesn't mean that all members of society are buying into this glorification. For example, glorification of football players, people who don't care about footballs, just don't know football players. They don't buy it. They think it's a cringe that people are watching what Messi is doing and just watching other people playing sport. You can see by the rhetorics of opening opposition how exactly people who do not care that much about sports think about the sport, even though there's a glorification of football players. It is similar here. Probably there is to some extent higher recognition among other members of society, which we think is just a very a minimum amount of recognition, particularly because this validation doesn't work with the people that opening position is concerned about, which is the bullies, people who kids that are just cruel and just usually have some problems and want to be aggressive toward other kids. They don't care just because some nerds think that they are cool because Faker is earning a lot of money. Similarly to the parents, because they might be concerned that their kids is spending too much time, 18 hours sitting in front of a computer and not doing a real job, just because there is some other kid doing a real job. It's not just simply going to say, oh, that's fine, etc. So we think that the difference in validation is the minimal from opening position, and therefore, if we present you a huge harms on our side, we can actually sway the debate on our side. Now, secondly, in terms of the second point about the players and how their autonomy is actually minimized. Note that the glorification specifically means that you have these role models that those gaming industry, let's say, just takes advantage of. This means that these players, firstly, they need to train for quite a lot of time because the connection between your head and hand and the reflexes just get worse even if you didn't play for 2 or 3 days before, etc. Which means that even if you don't feel like doing that, you simply have to because you have a contractual obligation that force you, etc. Secondly, besides of playing, that usually also those players are enjoying, you need to make videos, for ad revenues and things like that. This is specifically something that is linked to glorification that just creates the lives of these people that just has quite a lot of time. They need to also sacrifice a lot of time. It makes life for these people worse. Thirdly, we see that they police a lot of the time what you can say, what you cannot say. Now, notice, if opening opposition wants to claim that because of reputation, there are some very negative and toxic things that will be removed from this kind of industry, then they need also to concede that these people will be heavily censored in terms of what they can say and how they cannot express themselves. We think it puts all of these things put quite a lot of pressure on some kids who just started playing games, became good in it. I'll give you in a second, and then later on don't like it but cannot get away from the contractual obligations. Before I proceed, opening up.
Yeah, if your frame about glorification is true and there's going to be new government schools and massive increases in sponsorships and advertisements, how is that not going to make a comparative difference in the way that society views these particular kinds of hobbies?
So it is not intention because we say that it's going to create the difference, but precisely because the glorification means that more kids are playing video games and more kids care about these things. So therefore, these members of society are getting larger. We concede this, but we still think that the problems regarding that it is not recognized, but some adults, but also that there are some bullying still exist. Now, why glorification specifically provides distorted information? Note that there are just few winners, few people who can earn money and lots of kids who just play video games for a lot and never earn a cent. This is much different than most of the jobs, like, you know, if you're a dentist, most dentists earn enough. If you're an IT consultant, like working in IT, most people in IT working enough. So it means that here risks are high. Risks are definitely high in terms of your health. If you're sitting in front of a computer for 8 to 10 hours, it is not healthy for you. Your back hurts. It hurts to me even after judging one competition. Secondly, it is bad because you spend more time here by less time than you spend otherwise. And lastly, because it's difficult to find another career path. Now, why is this important? Because glorification specifically focuses only on the positive things, because those corporations do not want to present you negative things because they want exactly to brand themselves in the best way. So we think that for these reasons, exactly, it is that the glorification specifically provides distorted information from other players. So what you got from the open environment? You got that like the validation will exist anyway on both sides of the house. What changes this glorification is that actually we provide distorted information to new players, which forces more people to take a very risky career choice in which a lot of them will fail. Those who succeed will still be worse off rather than with some alternatives. Never more proud than false.
Oh, I'm very happy to call upon the deputy leader of opposition. Here.
Cool, thanks. Is this audible?
Yep.
Great. I'll take POIs in the chat if there are any. 2 parts to the speech. 1, OG's case, why it doesn't stand. 2, our case, why it does stand, and therefore why we win. First, dealing with OG's case. I'm going to deal with the last thing that came out of DPM, that there's distorted info and there's high risks into going into this esport, and that glorification does this somehow. The first thing I want to point out is it's very unclear what the difference here between this and any other type of sport is. To the extent that glorification gives you info and demonstrate that this is a possible career path, no matter how risky, I don't understand why that's necessarily a bad thing. But second, and this is critical, it is just not the case that glorification is the tipping point. Imagine a world in which esports players were not glorified. If esports players were not glorified, the companies that own these games, the clubs that own teams, and literally anyone that has a commercial incentive in this game still has a very strong incentive to attract players, to attract a viewer base. Clearly, OG does not think in the absence of glorification that the entire industry and the commercial viewing industry disappears. If that industry still exists, the same effects happen. The only difference is that the players aren't there to speak out against it and actually retail the real information. So at best for opening government, this is a wash, but I think we actually flip this onto our side, because glorification isn't just highlighting all the good things, noting that would happen anyway. The reason you glorify players is because they have overcome hardship. Maybe not all players, but obviously some players have done so. There are stories of people moving around from team to team for years before they broke into the industry. And critically, even if glorification itself doesn't entail that, glorification gives power to players themselves, who then have platforms to put out the message, because glorification means people follow players specifically and are more willing to listen to what they say. So on the comparative of where people enter esports and where they do it with more information, I think all the harmful incentives of portraying it well exist even in the absence of glorification. Glorification provides a possible correction, which is why that is out of the debate. Secondly, I want to deal with their main claim about toxic environment. Firstly, they say there's insults and heavy sexism. One, I just want to note this is a huge assertion, and to the extent it's an assertion, you have to weigh the logical analysis that Brent provides above this. It's unclear why this is true. It's unclear to what extent this applies. But even if this applies, let's deal with this head on. They say from PM that regulation is really hard because there are teens or youth individuals involved, and these are role models that can put really abusive behavior out there. One, it's very unclear to me when you're watching a game or a tournament why these players are likely to be abusive when they're just focused on playing their best and doing the best in the game. But secondly, they ignore the comparative that Brent set out. What is critical about esports is that even in the absence of watching professional gamers play, people are likely to watch streamers play instead on the comparative. Therefore, what you have to assess is not glorification of esports athletes in the abstract, but how they compare to streamers that people would otherwise watch. And if your concern on opening government is toxicity and brashness, I would argue we actually flip that claim and win it onto our side, because streamers are likely to be a lot more brash and toxic because they the way they garner viewers often a lot of times is by being extremely loud and being extremely brash and having all of this behavior. Now, I'm not going to say that all esports players are saints, but the point is esports players play the game because they are the best at it. And when they are the best at it, the focus shifts a bit within the community from that brash, loud playfulness to obviously you're still going to have some of that and some level of fun happening, but it's a lot more focused on the skill of players as well. So moving power away from streamers that people watch to esports players that people now watch means that we reduce on net the amount of toxicity that happens. And this is critical from Brent's speech when he talks about the comparative with streamers, right? Because when we have glorification of esports players, not only does the focus shift away from streamers, but they now have the foundation to become streamers themselves. So the actual content of streams also changes, not just the focus, which is why on net toxicity is better on our side. Even if that argument is not true, they are not immune to club pressure, as they say, because clubs obviously determine your contract and sponsorship. Look, obviously there's a balance here. Clubs have some powers and like players have some powers. We're saying glorification gives players sufficient power to do things like criticize small things, but obviously the club still pays your salary. You can't outright do really crazy and unclear things. So at the end of that, their argument about moving into the esports industry is being risky is out, and their argument about this being a toxic environment is out. Last thing they say is on the gaming industry, that you invest time and they police what you can say. Once again, I've shown you why investing time is not a tipping point. But secondly, in terms of policing what you can say, yes, obviously, like they'll police some things what you can say. Not all players will be able to speak out. But like obviously, like what are they policing? Like I'm not sure what OG thinks players are going to do. Like get up on stage and scream like racist or homophobic rants. It's very unclear what you're policing and why that's such a bad thing. Before I move on to our case, I'll take OG.
Yeah, the thing is that it is not a zero-sum game. Because there is glorification of professional players, more kids are into games and more kids are also watching streamers. Streamers have their streams views rising with this glorification. So therefore, all of these harms exist with a higher extent on our side.
Right, but that's not true because people who are into esports have usually already committed lots of hours to that specific game, which means the glorification is not the tipping point at which you start watching more streamers. But even if you do, if you are someone who specifically started watching because of players, you're going to watch that player's stream, not other streamers' streams. And given the effects I've described about how you change the content of streams and what people watch, that's still a net benefit on our side. Also, I have 1,500 hours on CSGO over 2 years. I didn't try to become a pro because I'm not crazy. Like people are quite well aware of the risks and they see how good you have to be. Our case, Brent tells you that you get validation because you see people like yourself potentially doing really well, and there's less stigma and alienation. We get two responses. One, the first is like you can go watch and compete yourself and there's validation among peers. The problem is these communities are often very small and don't provide you validation outside of that very specific community when everyone else is hating on you. But two, this is really important. When you're doing it among your own community, it's just like you're seen as your weird, small niche group rather than part of a wider community. Like if you play Dungeons and Dragons in your basement with your friends, like sure, there's validation among you, but you're still seen as the weird group of people. So this is not comparative. Second, they say not all people buy it, and they give the example of people finding football cringe. One, I think this is largely an internal feeling of validation, so you don't feel shame for doing it. But even if people find it cringe, they don't actively dismiss it. But two, even critical players play games. Like a lot of people who aren't hardcore gamers play COD, so like they can access this as well. So I think our validation point stands. Lastly, on power dynamics, one, we told you how esports players can stick up to companies and clubs. The critical thing I want to add here is a lot of companies and clubs support gambling operations and loot box. I think Betway and CSGO, where kids lose thousands of dollars a year. Critically, what esports players can do against these commercial incentives is speak out because they care most about the integrity of the game and they have the power to do it. They can play games without skins and show people you don't know it. They can tell children to not buy loot boxes. Critically, this is something that only happens on our side, where we move power away from companies and sponsors towards players to some extent. On those grounds, OG doesn't have a case. We do, we win.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for an excellent speech, and indeed all speakers for a very good demo debate. Thank you all for coming here. Some of you also, especially in like wild time zones in the far west. Really appreciate all of you for doing this. We will now need to ask you to leave the call. If you want to watch the OA, you can do this on the stream with everyone else. We will also stream the discussion. We'll try to be nice. I think we can easily do that because it was a high quality debate. All right. Julio, let's take a minute to go over notes and then we'll start chatting.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Are you prepared with an initial?
I think so, yeah.
All right. How do you currently see this debate?
So I probably would lean towards OO, I think.
I am marginally leaning OO as well. I think it's quite close, though I want to have a discussion about this.
Yeah.
Let's start by having a very quick summary of cases. Could you tell me what do you think OG proved and OO proved in the debate in terms of bottom lines?
Absolutely. So I think largely the debate can be summed up in terms of, so prop really focuses a lot on the environment itself, right? Talking about how firstly it's kind of establishing what this space looks like, what glorification is, especially in the like increase of focus and money towards these kinds of activities. Secondly, how that creates a toxic environment, especially in the fact that like regulation is difficult, and what you end up happening, both because of the empowerment of the role models, so they have more power than the companies themselves, and how, especially if you have a pre-existing toxic environment, this just amplifies the kind of toxicity that exists and is performed. And then secondly, how the bigger focus, or secondly, how once there's a bigger focus on this, it's more likely to push people towards this career path, which isn't necessarily a positive thing due to a lack of information, due to difficult kind of like career and life circumstances that this entails. And then thirdly, why the validation and like benefits of the supposed like validation that comes from a widespread acceptance or glorification actually isn't either existent, or two, not necessarily a positive one. And then in terms of what opposition tries to prove, firstly, it's kind of the opposite of the validation. When you have like widespread glorification, that means more attention, that means normalization, which means there's likely to be more validation about this as a desire for a career path in terms of how this operates. So you're going to destigmatize things. Secondly, you're going to create less problematic power dynamics, insofar as when people are empowered, they're more likely to speak out against both the environment, potentially a toxic environment, but also the companies themselves, right? Abhinav is a good example of like the loot boxes and how people can criticize those same corporate entities. And then I think finally, in terms of how this actually allows for a shift in kind of addressing some of the problems and incentives that exist towards creating a more sustainable or better kind of environment for gaming, especially in the fact that a lot of these problems are non-unique insofar as they exist outside of the glorification. So not glorifying doesn't resolve anyways, but it at least allows a pathway to potentially resolve these things that you wouldn't necessarily have on prop. I think those are probably the big things that you said.
Just to summarize this in terms of themes, I think the main basic clashes between the themes end up being toxicity and where we have more of it. Secondly, the direct impact on gamers and how they spend their time. And lastly, on stigma and validation. Now I'm going to ask something, because we do want to focus on engagement in this, and I think this is part of why this call is close to me. There was a lot of back and forth going in all of these clashes eventually when teams tried to mitigate each other. By the end of this, what do you think remains standing? Or in other words, who do you think wins which of the questions? Do you think one side manages to completely take down the entire other side, or no?
Well, where I think what I think has me most convinced towards op, that makes me lean towards them, is in terms of the issue of kind of like the toxic environment and like the space in and of itself, right? Because I do think there's a degree to which, while like I think like intuitively and like just based off experience and like saying that there is like toxicity within the gaming community or the gaming world is like a valid enough statement, but I think there is a degree to which it is asserted, especially in the professional world, and how this necessarily manifests itself. And so I think we do get a consistent response and attack as to how like not like in fact you might actually be more likely to be able to address, or because of the change in power dynamics, you are more likely to be able to address or resolve these things. So insofar as that resolves the biggest issue in terms of like how, like what is the environment in which this exists in, and especially if those problems exist on either world independent of glorification, that I think to me already puts op at a significant advantage, because the question then becomes how much does the issue of validation and potential problematic career paths and things like that outweigh the issues of how this affects the community?
Yeah, so that's the main question I have, because I agree that op managed to effectively flip the toxicity point, and I think this clash they win quite effectively. What I think they are being a tad less charitable in, and I presumably will go over the rebuttal soon, is in terms of gamers spending their time and government's entire mechanisms as to why gamers are likely to now neglect their studies a bit more, maybe play much more hours than is good for them, have been misinformed to think that they can be successful in it, etc. I think some of the rebuttals there are not sufficient. So I think while they managed to mitigate it from op, there is some mechanization remains standing from opposition, from government. Just to be clear on why I think this is the case, while opposition does say effectively there is still incentive for the market to try and market it for as many participants as possible, and there is still people are generally aware that they cannot be successful in it. I think this answers parts of the analysis from government, but definitely not all of it, right? So it doesn't answer the nuances coming from Juanita about how role models are particularly much more glorified when they are seen as the national heroes, yada, yada, and therefore you're much more likely to want to be like them. How the specific marketing system isn't just broad term marketing without explaining what it means from op, but explicitly saying from government, thinking that you can be like them, thinking that this is accessible, etc. With that being the case, and with Gov still having at least some of the materials standing and people spending time that they will never get back, how does opposition manage to outweigh this, in your opinion?
So I think for me, the big manner that this is outweighed is just in terms like what is the most likely outcome here based off like the power structures that exist, right? So I think this manifests itself primarily in two manners. Firstly, the one of like does the glorification, like how much does the glorification impact some of these issues, right? Because if the problem exists a priori to glorification, there likely is to be some difference. So I think it doesn't like defeat the argument in and of itself, but it does bring up the question like how unique is this problem to where proposing the motion meaningfully resolves some of these issues within the community itself? And so I think if I don't have a clear answer to that, it does undermine some of the biggest impacts that you gain on it, especially in terms of the national heroes, especially in terms of like the career paths. I think the disinformation thing is a fair one, but at the same time, that's meaningfully addressed by the fact that like when you empower these people, they are likely to then be able to tell those stories and resolve that same issue of information. And then I think secondly, in terms of like the specific mechanisms for like what happens when you do have this glorification, are able to shift this focus. I think the best illustration of this, for example, is in terms of, and so I guess this admittedly connects to the first point as well, is when like if there is no focus on the competition, people are likely to go towards streaming instead, where it's more based on entertainment, which means that there's a higher likelihood to have that toxic space, especially without greater structures kind of enforcing it. So this is where it's like, I think I do buy that there are harms towards being a gamer. Like the response, like I think the response is like, like these issues exist with other sports, like are true, but mostly mitigatory, because even if they exist with other sports, that's not necessarily a unique harm that like beyond, like it's engagement, but not necessarily one that defeats the argument. But it's still like, but insofar as like the harms themselves are still existent in either world, it's still hard for me to like outweigh them over the potential resolutions that come uniquely from glorification and the empowerment of people.
Completely agree. I'm going to soon start the OA, but before that, I want to make one general comment to summarize what we just did for the viewers, because we are focusing on engagement today. I think an important thing to take from this debate about engagement and how you evaluate it within debates, there is a tendency often of inexperienced judges to see engagement as some sort of a binary. Does the rebuttal take down the point or does it not take down the point? And there's no in between. Most often, especially in high quality debates such as the one that we've seen, this would exist on a spectrum. There will be a lot of mechanisms and analysis given by a very good team and a lot of mitigations given by the other team, which in most cases won't completely take down the point, but would change the extent of it. And the thing that a qualified judge, an experienced judge, want to do with that then is not go to heuristics and try to find the reason why the rebuttal is completely or not completely taken down, despite this being the easy path. It's not usually the likely path, but rather try and weigh on the margins. Try to assess by the end of rebuttals, how much of the impact of the case still stands and compare it to the other standing impacts. I'll try to do this now in the OA. So note to viewers, what we're going to do now is I'm going to give a quick OA for the debate, summarizing most of what Julio and I just discussed. And then Julio will also do specific comments on engagement because we wanted to focus on this for today. With that in mind, the call. We ended up reaching a unanimous decision. We also started with one, but we do think it was close and we think it was a very good debate on both sides. Three main clashes we identified within the debate that I'm going to use to explain the call. The first is on toxicity, which we thought ended up being quite heavy in terms of its volume of the debate and the impact that it got. Secondly, on gamers and how they spend their time and the trade-offs with other opportunities. And lastly, on stigma and validation. Let's go one by one and see why eventually opposition wins it on the margins. Firstly, on toxicity. We think that there's a lot of good content coming from Prime Minister explaining why the likely case is the environment being quite toxic, why it trickles down to viewers who also replicate this behavior, etc. Not going into all of the analysis right now because this is not the focus of today and we have a limited time, but I want to focus more on the engagement with it from opposition and the back and forth that happened later on in DPM and DLO. Opposition from leader of opposition start by pointing out the comparative. Toxicity exists on both sides of the debate. And by the way, important note, which I think is good for this debate, I am very happy that both sides very early on framed and clarified exactly what is unique to glorification as opposed to falling down to the symmetries which are very tempting in this debate of, gaming exists anyway. Opposition says, toxicity exists anyway. Streamers are toxic, the community is toxic. The main difference is when there is a marketing incentive for the companies involved in it, and when you have glorified people who are very heavily watched, they have an incentive to regulate what these speakers say, right? You want to regulate how they interact with the community and not allow them to be as toxic as they would have otherwise been. Comes up DPM, and I think does well to try and engage this. And I want to also flag here something important about how the rebuttal was done. This was not just throwing a one line, but actually doing the full structure of what opposition said, what is our response to this, why it takes it down, which I think is probably what you want to implement in your own refutations. What does DPM says? DPM says, opposition says that toxicity exists anyway because the community, because the companies try to market, because people still play games, and now the company tries to market it, and therefore there is less of this toxicity because the company regulates it. However, tells us DPM, there are more viewerships to specific role models, which are perceived as national heroes, per Juanita's analysis and opposition's concession. And they say the company can't fully regulate what these individuals do. Because they have such a lot of prestige, because they are being glorified, because a lot of people watch them, it means that people do actually believe them, and they often can speak for themselves and not be fully regulated by the companies. This currently mitigates a lot of the response coming from opposition. Comes back deputy leader of opposition afterwards. We think that they do two main things with different degrees of efficacy. The first one is mitigating the response. And here note, it is important to rebut not only constructive points from the other side, but also the rebuttals. So, rebuttal the rebuttal, actually try to rebuild your cases. So here they say, but even if they have a lot of prestige and a lot of clout and people view them and they can talk against what the company tells them, eventually they do still get their salary from the companies directly. They're still bound by it, meaning that they still are likely to not be fully toxic Also, they are likely to not focus a lot on their toxicity, because when we talk about the very best players out there, it is likely that we focus more on their skills as opposed to other things that they might have said otherwise. We think so far this rebuttal is still mostly a mitigation, albeit an effective one. It doesn't completely take down the notion that, but they still have some degree of freedom. There comes the slightly more effective rebuttal, I think, from the LO, when they bring back the counterfactual. And here they say, and this is another important thing to note that speakers did in the debate, which I think is very good. You don't have to rebut everything. It's good that both DPM and DLO conceded a lot of the points coming in each other's speeches, because you can't rebut everything, but rather try to show, I don't need to win the world, I just need to win the room. Let's show why the counterfactual is comparatively worse. DLO says, streaming exists on both sides, meaning that the high exposure that gamers have to potential toxicity is higher. Even if the potential good gamers that are being currently glorified are still being toxic, they are likely to be comparatively speaking less toxic than otherwise streamers. This is for two reasons. First, they get a salary, so even if it's not completely obligating them, it is marginally speaking more obligating them than someone who doesn't get a salary at all. And secondly, because of the fact that they are the best and the highest skilled, meaning that in the first place, they attract views mostly focusing on their skills and their good ability to play, as opposed to their nasty comments. For those reasons, we think quite effectively opposition manages to show that even if on both sides there is toxicity, on their sides it's marginally preferable. Going then to discuss the time that gamers spend. What does opening government give us here? Firstly, just in terms of their analysis as to how people are likely to spend their time, I think they give several mechanizations. Some of them start already in the characterization of how the glorification looks like in Prime Minister. A, these people are perceived as role models, as national heroes, people that you want to be like. B, they are specifically marketed to you as people who are becoming very successful and very accessible. Everyone can do this. You get the vibe that everyone can become a gamer, so you want to do this yourself. C, because many countries also put a heavy focus on this as national heroes as it becomes more popular, you also get more funding of this, schools created for this, etc. And lastly, the marketing systems that are created within the private companies that want to attract more people to view these glorified heroes mean that they are making it marketed as more attractive and more accessible, and try to, as then also pointed out by DPM, actively misinform you, try to hide the negative aspects of it and not show how hard it is to be successful, and focus on the positive aspects of it so you cannot make an informed decision on it. Then they give us some impacts of it. This is mutually exclusive with studying. This means that you also invest a lot of money in the process because you need to buy stuff in order to be a good gamer. And this means also that you get less resistance from other people because your parents are less likely to try and push you away from it once it's being so normalized. What does opposition do? And here I want to point out, I think we agreed by the end of the discussion, opposition mitigates a lot of the claims from government, but never completely takes them down. So some of the impacts of the argument do remain standing. The first response we get is not everyone pursues it as a career, which we end up accepting, but we think is not really engaging or charitable to the more nuanced description coming from PM that says, even if not everyone pursues it as a career, A, much more people see it as accessible and try, and B, even if you don't want to be a career professional gamer, you want to be more like them because they are role models to you. So this is a partial mitigation. The second response, which I think we discussed a little in the discussion, is it's like other sports, it's like rugby, it's like any other thing that wastes your time. While we agree with it, and we don't think that government ever proved esports to be maybe particularly unique, we are not necessarily certain that they have the burden to prove this. Here, flagging back to the education briefing, by the way, teams don't get to just throw burdens on each other. They need to explain why something is a burden if they claim so. If opposition wants to say government has a burden of proving uniqueness, they need to explain why. Otherwise, it sounds like, okay, there might be other negative things in the world. We might also oppose rugby, but this is also another negative thing, so let's not have this in addition. Then come some of the more nuanced responses. A, people are encouraged to participate in the gaming industry regardless, because the companies still want to market it as attractive, even absent the glorified players. So they would probably still open schools and still try to make a lot of advertisements, etc. I want to track directly how it tackles the government's analysis and see what it does take down and what it doesn't. Going through the mechanisms, role models sounds to still stand, even if it is still being advertised in other ways. It is not answering the unique aspect of role models as a means of advertising. National heroes, similarly, then it does take down to some extent the idea of schools trying to publish it more and the fact that the marketing systems are publicizing it as attractive. And lastly, we do have some material standing also remains unanswered from government as to how it is actively misinforming, how you use these players to make people believe that it is actually more accessible than it would have otherwise been. So the rebuttal takes down some of the mechanisms, not all of them. The second addition that opposition adds to this is the idea that now individuals can counteract this. The esports players who are being glorified can say, oh, but there are also harms to this. While this is a potential good response, we think that this is a bit lacking. A, because there is a slight difference between can and will. We are not necessarily certain that they proved why it's likely that this is how players will actually talk, especially when most of their analysis explains why these players are bound to what companies want them to say. So it's uncompletely clear to us why they are actually likely to criticize the negative aspects of it. By the end of this, we think that it is likely that people do waste more time and money on these games than they would have otherwise, albeit we do agree that it is somewhat mitigated. Lastly, on validation, we think that this is sufficiently proven by the end by OO. The opposition tells us there is stigma against people who play games. This is also trickling down to people who are perceived as nerds as general, because these are usually people who are perceived as gamers. And this means that they are being perceived as weirdos, they are alienated by society, etc. Opening government tries to respond to this in DPM with two main responses. The first one is, not everyone views it. The people who glorify it most are the gamers themselves. We think that this is a potential rebuttal that could have worked in a different debate, not when A, Prime Minister starts by explaining why it is heavily publicized to everyone and normalizes it in schools and to other people, also pointed out by DLO. Secondly, when the direct response of Prime Minister to the POI given by opposition is that they do think that others will also glorify these players. So we don't think this particular rebuttal does much. The second rebuttal, however, says you're already validated by your peers anyway, and this is all that's important, right? Because you still feel like you can do this. Opening opposition answers this later on saying, wait, other nerds are always also validated by their peers. It doesn't give them the feeling of actually not being alienated. It's not enough to be validated by your peers when you're still a secluded group playing in your basement. We end up with opening opposition taking quite significantly the point of toxicity, slightly less the point of validation, and opening government taking the point of gamers' time, to an extent at least. How do we weigh this? What we ended up doing is, I think, weighing in terms of the marginal difference or who managed to show a bigger impact, not necessarily in what is more important in abstract in the world, but in terms of what changes more in the world. Opening opposition does it in two ways. Firstly, albeit their mitigation is not completely taking down the government material, they managed to show that at least some of the harms are symmetric. So even if players waste more time and more money on it, absent this, people would still spend a lot of time and a lot of money on it, meaning that the marginal difference there is relatively small, albeit existing, as compared to the marginal difference of toxicity and validation being shown to be much more unique in its nature. Secondly, in terms of just the number of people directly impacted by this, given that opening opposition manages to show that it effectively affects almost all players within the community, because currently all gamers are perceived as nerds, outcasts, etc., and impacted by the toxicity within their community. And as opposed to them, they say not all gamers will see it as a career path and try to pursue it themselves. It's likely that they impact just more players. For those reasons, albeit on the margins, because we do think most of opening government's material still stands to an extent, we end up giving it to opposition. I will now give the stage to Julio to add some remarks on engagement.
Cool, thanks, Hadar. So I think I'm probably gonna sum this up in, I think, 3 points, one with like admittedly 2 little sub-points, since a lot of it already touches on things that Hadar explained in the OA as to why we kind of reached the conclusions that we did. But I think conclusions are worth considering for novices, but in general for everyone who's wanting to learn from this round. I think firstly, the big thing to remember always is like it's important to try and figure out how effective the refutation is, right? Because engaging or refuting with something in and of itself isn't necessarily valuable, especially if the conclusion of what that is achieving is mostly mitigatory. Now, to be fair, even mitigation can be helpful in the sense where at least you're reducing the harm of the argument and not, and so it's not necessarily as impactful, but at the same time, it is worth considering what is the relative weight of mitigating something versus the other stuff you could be doing in that time, such as taking it entirely. I think this happens mainly in two manners. Like, I think this the two best examples of this within the round are firstly in the response of like how this kind of like negative glorification or space occurs with other sports as well. In that, insofar as that's definitely a correct observation, but what are the conclusions of that observation that meaningfully mean that like the glorification in this situation is harmful or impactful enough to do anything about it? That is a question that I think remains. And insofar as that question is still there, the impacts of that line of analysis still remain mostly mitigatory. I think the same thing is true though in some of the analysis that comes up in the DPM, at least in terms of how this relates to like the niche groups and the relative sizes, in part because at least up until that point in the debate, there is somewhat the OG is still missing at least some degree of engaging with the counterfactual, right? And like, what is the world look like without this kind of glorification, and why this is uniquely harmful? So even if we accept that this is probably going to be true, this is probably true, and there are these harms in this harms in which the glorification does exist or benefits that without it, the relative differences are still unclear enough to the point where it's hard to grant that much leeway or validity here. So I think the first like conclusion or takeaway is it's always important to not just engage, but engage meaningfully, because having answers isn't necessarily enough in and of itself enough. Secondly, I think, and this is where it's like, what are the options that you can do to try and meaningfully engage, and how did this come up in the round? I think one of the big things that often, especially for people who are beginning or even at like the middle stages of debate, is that it's easy to confuse refutation with meaning I'm going to say about why the other team is entirely wrong, rather than just trying to adapt to it, right? So I think my old debate coach had a phrase that I always loved, which is, why go for the takeout when you can go for the turn? And I think the best example of that in this round is exactly what happens in terms of like the economic structures and powers in this case, right? From the beginning of Juanita's speech in the PM, she does a lot of analysis as to how like the glorification implies like significant economic structures. You're going to create schools, you're going to create more focus and attention, right? Both Brett and Abhinav, neither of them necessarily reject that. If anything, they openly embrace that vision of what the PM and what OG sees in this debate. But rather than directly refuting it and saying why that's wrong or why that's likely to be more harmful or pervasive, they turn it on them and show how that's specifically a positive thing, insofar as when that is supposedly true and that economic power is existent, that allows them to be able to actually create more steps towards resolving the very harms that OG lays out. And this happens in two direct ways, right? One, the first is that's basically the second argument, where they talk about power dynamics. This is directly and kind of indirectly, but using the ideas, engaging with the layout of the case and what are the likely structures involved in this case by talking about how the power dynamics are shifted. But then this happens even more so in the DLO, focusing on the potential alternatives of what happened and the counterfactual in when this glorification doesn't exist. So that's in terms of like the takeouts itself. But I think this also occurs in terms of framing, and I think a good example of this is in the beginning of Ilya's speech in the DPM, right? When we're talking about like validation. Validation becomes a significant argument in terms of for the opposition team, in terms of the motivation that pushes people to do this, and how this is likely to not just make people feel better, but likely be more motivated and be able to better achieve these results in a more like positive mindset, right? I think Ilya points out that in a lot of ways, this validation, like the most important versions of these validations tend to be internal, especially amongst your group of peers, that like even if there is some degree, what he does is kind of frame things in a way that it's like, even if if it's true that this validation is more likely to exist in like a more widespread manner in the opposition's world, the validation that we most particularly care about or think about is likely to be the one that is in the internal one that occurs within these communities. And for the people who are likely to be more harmful or toxic, such as bullies or those who are cruel, that kind of external validation isn't likely to meaningfully change things there. So again, isn't necessarily directly refuting or saying that they're wrong in terms of how that there's likely to be a validation, but frames and engages in a manner that still pushes towards things to their side. So I think in summary, the second thing is that engagement looks like a lot of different things, and it oftentimes is erroneous to just assume that engagement is directly refuting or attacking or taking down the other argument. You can frame, you can turn things around, you can do a multitude of things. So you should feel the comfort in doing this. I think the last thing I want to say here, and this also kind of extends towards another version of engagement, is the value and oftentimes necessity of like deep characterization of actors and incentives and what involves here. And I think where, like, for example, I and I think Hadar too were most like compelled by a lot of the op case was exactly in this understanding of like, what do these companies actually care about? How do these spaces operate? What are the alternatives, right? If you're not a professional, like when you are a professional gamer, what are you focusing on? What are you not focusing on? How does that space, like, how do the alternatives work? And so this is where Abhinav's analysis of like professional gamers focusing more on like the mechanics versus the alternatives being streamers and entertainment comes into play, right? Even if there's not necessarily like direct lines of responsiveness or analysis towards this, the more characterization engagement we're given here directly refutes and talks about the like toxic environment that Juanita lays out in her speech, because it starts to challenge these ideas like what is the manner in which this is actually likely to function. And if we start to buy in to the characterization or to the layout of how these spaces work in the opposition's world, it becomes a bit harder to buy into propositions, at least the most significant harms. Like Hadar said, there are still things that absolutely end up still working into the debate for proposition in terms of harms of like the direct harms of career choices and how you're more likely to like even if there's likely to be some degree of less of misinformation because players are now empowered, that kind of motivation to go down a road that is difficult, the fact that you're mostly spent like staying indoors, that there are risks for your health, those are admittedly things that I think to some degree go unresponded to by the opposition. So this is partly where like the engagement that they do is quite effective, and this is what allows them to kind of like turn the debate and focus more towards like their weights, but exactly where proposition or opening government still has strengths here is not almost entirely, but it has a large part due to somewhat of a lack of engagement and focus on those specific points. So this works really well as an example of how engagement or lack thereof played in towards each side's favor in terms of figuring out what was left standing at the end of the debate. I think everything else was already covered in what was a really excellent OA. So I think that covers it for comments on my part. So are we good then?
I think we are. Thank you very much, Julio, for joining us today. And thank you again, everyone, both like viewers for watching. Thanks for like the speakers that came today. Thank you, Lee, for streaming this. And we'll see you in the next demo debate. Good luck in round 5.
Good luck, everyone.